Hello fellow humans and welcome to Computer Science for Humans. My name is Reagan and in today's video we're going to show you how you can use Git and GitHub with your projects. If you're curious what exactly Git is and what all the hype is about, you can see my other video about what exactly is Git, in which I talk about what it is, where it comes from, and why we use it. Now, before we get started, I do want to mention that this video is tailored specifically toward people who are brand new to Git or maybe just haven't used it in a while and are needing a brief refresher. So if that's you, you're in the right place. Also keep in mind that what I'm about to show you is not by any means the only way to use Git or the only way to use source control, but I find this to be the easiest and most straightforward method that you can use and is often similar to or exactly the same as the process you'll usually find on the job. Of course, your mileage may vary, and if you know other alternative ways to use GitHub that are particularly interesting, feel free to let me know in the comments below. So, as you might be able to guess, the first thing we need to do in order to actually use Git with GitHub is install it. After all, Git is a software that runs on your computer just like Microsoft Word or anything else. Also keep in mind there are some minor differences from Mac to PC. I'm on a Windows, so I'm obviously using the PC stuff, but for the most part, this process that I'm about to show you is almost exactly the same. And whenever there are differences that I'm aware of, I'll make sure to put them in a text box somewhere around here. Somewhere on the screen. So to start with, you're going to need to make an account with GitHub. I briefly mentioned this in the other video, but just to get it out of the way again, Git is basically the software that runs on your computer. GitHub is basically the cloud server that you store code on. And while you don't have to use them together, it's usually easier just to use Git with GitHub instead of trying to mix and match other things. I'm not going to go through the process of creating an account because I already have an account and I'm pretty sure everybody knows how to make an account by now. So go ahead and do that and then feel free to pause the video and we will meet up again once you are signed in. Now that you're logged in, you should see something similar to this, though of course the design may change over time depending on when you're watching this video. The main thing I want to draw your attention to is that giant new button up in the corner. This button creates a new repository. Now, if you don't already know the word repository, like most regular people don't, myself included when I first got started with this, it's basically just a fancy way of saying place to store your code. So the repository is your project. Whatever project you're working on that you want to store on Git, because remember, the purpose of Git in the first place is to store your code and be able to easily, conveniently share it with other people and work on the same project at the same time as them. So with that in mind, a repository is basically just the project that you're wanting to make. At least at the time of filming this, you can make any number of repositories for free. They have features that you can pay for, but that's only really relevant if you're a massive company, at least in my experience. So to start with, we are going to click New, and we end up on this page. And I know for a lot of people this can be kind of overwhelming at first. Don't worry about most of what you see. A lot of it is really completely irrelevant at first and only matters more later. But we'll still go through each section of this to give you an idea of what you're looking at and what the importance of each piece of this page is. So first, let's talk about repository name. This is pretty simple. It's just the name of your project as GitHub will see it. This does not have to match anything in your actual code. It's literally just the name of the folder that GitHub is going to store your project in. So for this, we're going to have a really simple project, just a simple hello world kind of thing. And I'm going to call it starting with Git. Notice that if I have spaces, it replaces them with dashes. This is because it doesn't want spaces in the name. So sometimes you might just want to start with dashes instead of spaces. It really doesn't matter. You can use numbers if you want. But you'll notice that a lot of special characters like this $sign I just randomly threw in there for explanation purposes are removed. So keep that in mind while you're coming up with your name. They also have a random name generator for your project that they suggest in case you're not really wanting to come up with a creative name or an uncreative name. So you can also just click that and it'll fill it in for you. But for us, we're going to call it Get Started. Get it? And I am going to put the dash there so that the extra coloration goes away and I don't keep getting distracted by it. Next, you'll notice the description. Obviously, as it says, this is optional. I usually do like a couple words or maybe a sentence describing it if the name of my repository isn't clear or if I have a specific thing I'm creating this for. So in this case, I'm going to let myself know that this is for explanation purposes of Git. And below that, you see public or private. This is exactly what you would imagine. Public is visible to anyone. Private is only visible to you and people you specify. Used to, you had to pay for private, but they made private repos free in the last few years. So now you don't have to pay for it, which is really nice. I'm going to have mine be private right now, but do be aware that you can change the publicity later on if you need to. Next, we have the section that's a little more nitty-gritty, I guess you could say, but it's really not too complicated. You can add a README file, which I highly recommend if you're planning on sharing this with anybody else at all, especially if you are writing something in a large context, like if you are only one programmer on a team of developers, or maybe there are multiple teams of developers and people you've never met might be looking at your code at some point and trying to figure out what's going on. The README is basically the instructions. If you think about the instruction manual that comes along with, say, a piece of furniture or something and tells you how to build it, how to construct it, which parts go where, and any kind of extra stuff you might need to know about it. READMEs are very, 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 very important if you are planning on sharing this with anybody. If it's just for yourself, honestly, I don't think it matters at all. I almost never do any significant READMEs if it is a private repo. Repo is short for repository, by the way, unless it is a project that I might put down for a long time and then come back to later, and maybe I need to make sure I remember how to actually start it or something like that. How much of a README you make is completely up to you and your specific needs, and a lot of companies actually have specific requirements for what their READMEs need to look like. Although I will say, in my experience, those requirements are usually a little more lax than they probably should be. Remember that this README is the first thing that anyone who wants to look at your code is going to see. They see this before they look at your code. It's on the front page of the repository in GitHub, which I will show you later once we actually have one. So if you have any desire to share this repo with other people, I highly recommend you put at least basic instructions into the README, and you can get some pretty fancy layouts if you want to. So I'm going to go ahead and add a README so that we can talk about it and you can see an example. And next we have the gitignore file. The gitignore file is a little confusing for a lot of people, but in short, it is a file with a list of file names that you want to not put on GitHub. Now, you may be wondering if GitHub's purpose is to store my code and my code files, right? Why would I not want it to store certain files, or why would I want it to ignore files? And this may be more of a big deal or less of a big deal, depending on the language you are programming in. For example, for Java, whenever you compile, you create, in addition to the actual runnable, executable Java files, you also have .class files. Class files are just for Java. They help Java convert the code into binary eventually, and they are completely, totally, and utterly useless to programmers except for running your code to test it. And when someone downloads the code onto their own computer, the first thing they're going to do is compile it and run it. So you really don't need to use that extra space putting class files that may be obsolete depending on what you've done recently, because I don't know about you, but I usually forget to go back and delete the extra class files I'm not using. So putting those into the gitignore file and telling Git to ignore every .class file really removes a lot of clutter from the project over time. Another example would be if you have JavaScript background. If you've ever used Node or NPM, then you are probably at least passingly familiar with the Node modules file. I say file, it's a folder. This folder is enormous and usually takes 5 or 10 minutes to install, depending on your internet connection. So there's no real reason to put that onto GitHub, because that means you've increased the amount of time it takes to download your repository by like 5 minutes, maybe more, again, depending on the internet connection. So instead, the convention, what we've all kind of decided is the best practice to do, is to tell Git to ignore the Node modules file, and then when you download the code onto your own computer, you then manually install the Node modules file using the npm command line or whatever tool you're going to use. Now that's all specific to those particular languages, but the point is that the gitignore file lets you focus on only the important files that are unique to your project and ignore everything else. So if you have any extra clutter files, or maybe even just text files that would either be easy to duplicate for someone else running your code, or that are just completely unnecessary, then you can put that into the gitignore and it will ignore them. So all that to say, the gitignore is basically just designed to make sure there's no extra clutter in your project. So you'll see it starts with none. This is fine if you're doing a really small thing, but for our purposes, I'm going to go ahead and pick one. Now, the project I'm going to do is in JavaScript, so I'm going to actually use the Node one. And that way I can show you what it looks like, even though we're not going to be using npm. But because I'm using JavaScript, I picked the node git ignore template, and it already knows these are a lot of things that come with JavaScript that often would have to be added, so it goes ahead and adds them to the file. And again, I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Next, you have a license. Now, I want to preface this saying I'm not an attorney. That said, there are a few basic rules to keep in mind with your license. And when it comes down to it, if you're doing this for personal uses, you don't really need to worry too much of a license. If it's private, you really don't need a license at all. If you're planning on sharing it with other people, you really should include the license so that those other people know how they are allowed to interact with your program. For example, if I pull up this list here, you'll see there's a whole bunch of things. And don't worry, you don't need to go through and learn all of these. I would recommend at least touching up on the basic ideas of some of them, specifically the ones that I'm going to put on the screen now. Those are the most common ones, the ones that you will most frequently see on open source projects. But feel free, obviously, to look into this as much as you want to, as much as is interesting. But again, the bare minimum, at least know more or less what kinds of things the ones on the screen do. Right now, I'm going to give you a basic summary. Again, this is not legal advice. So if you actually need to know the legal ramifications of this stuff, then please talk to an attorney. But here's a basic idea of what some of these mean. So first, we're going to go over the MIT license. I'm not going to pull up the text of it or anything, but basically the idea behind that is people are free to do what they want with the code as long as they make sure to include a reference to the MIT license in that code. Meaning, if you want to use someone's code that is under the MIT license, your code using it is also under the MIT license. And MIT, you might recognize that as the famous institution, and yes, it is that MIT. They often use it with some code examples they have that are for more academic purposes. Basically, they just want to make sure that since they made it, they want to make it freely available, but also get the credit for having made it in the first place. So if you don't really care what people do with your code, you're not trying to sell anything, you want something to be available freely to people, but you want to make sure you maintain the credit for it, for your part of it, then MIT license is a pretty decent one to go with. The Apache 2.0 license is another one I want to mention. It is a little more constrictive than the MIT license. It has a few regulations on how people are allowed to use it and also make sure that you get the credit for it. And then the GNU, General Public License, I don't know much about the different versions. I usually don't use it for my purposes, but it's for more proprietary stuff. So you'll want to use it more likely if you want to make sure nobody uses your stuff without your express permission, that kind of thing. Again, for details, you'll need to read it yourself or get an attorney or something like that. And finally, another popular one sometimes is the unlicensed, which basically says, I don't care what you do with this, I'm just having it here, have fun. This has absolutely no restrictions on it, hence the unlicensed. Not really licensing it, it's just saying, yeah, do what you want, I don't care. Those are the main ones. And as you can see, there are a lot more, and you can go into a lot of depth on this if you want to. I'm sure the list is much longer than they even have here. For the purposes of this, I'm gonna have this just be the unlicensed, because I don't care. And again, it's a private repository just for this purpose. So if I was doing something with a team, I'd probably do something like the MIT license. If it was on a more educational kind of spectrum, and if it was more proprietary, I'd go with something closer to GNU, or maybe depending on the size of the project, I might have an attorney write up my own license, which is ultimately what you want to do if you are a large company selling the proprietary software. So next, I'm going to click Create Repository. And it brings us to the main page of the repository. What you're looking at right now, this is the repository. And the main thing to keep in mind with this is what you are seeing right now is my project, the Get Started project, as it exists on the GitHub cloud server. Right now, it's not on my computer. I can't edit the code, not really. And I haven't actually made anything yet, right? This literally just told Git to prepare the way for our project. You'll see right here is the git ignore file, the license file, and the readme file. If you scroll down, you'll see the readme. Very, very simple right now. Some people get very elaborate with them. This is why the readme is so important. Whenever you go to a repository, like imagine that you were some random person, you just happen across this repository. The first thing you see is the files, the folders and stuff, but right underneath that is the readme, which has all the instructions and details you need to be able to contribute to the project or otherwise use it. So now that we actually have a repository, let's install Git so that we can get the repository onto our computer.